Yeah, wine is very special, and it wasn't invented; it was discovered, and we can't just eradicate something like that. And I think it's as we all get, as we're getting older, my kids are becoming. They've always been around wine. I mean, I started in this industry when I had my fourth, and she's now 10. So I think it's something that they've always been around, but as you get older, you become more curious and you want to taste things and you want to grow your palate and things like that. And so I do think that our culture, thankfully, is continuing to surround ourselves with wine and with community. And with community comes sharing things like that. So yeah, I think wine is it has a very special place in our culture. And I think we all should be protecting that for sure.
Welcome back to Barrels and Roots. My name is Sean, and I'm your host, and I have an awesome guest with me today. Would you like to tell people who you are and a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, so I am Jess McDowell. I am the owner and winemaker of Jess McDowell Consulting. I am a contract winemaker for three clients right now. I have Kever Vineyards, Rewa Vineyards as well, and then Lindstrom. So yeah, I manage the wine production across all three clients in Napa Valley.
That's awesome. Now, how did you get into winemaking in the first place?
Yeah, I love this question and I love hearing the answers of this question because I feel like everyone has such a unique story. And I'd like to say mine is also unique. I worked I grew up in Pennsylvania, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is a pretty rural community. Most people associate that with Amish. I am not Amish, but really respect that community over there. So I grew up over there. I went to school for dental hygiene and I worked as a dental hygienist for about 10 years. And I really loved all of the facets of the dental industry. I liked working in hygiene, but I also liked kind of putting my hand into orthodontics and all of the other avenues. And so I went back to school to pursue dentistry. So that was my main goal. So met my then fiance out in Pennsylvania. We sort of uprooted and came here to California. And I was just kind of feeling it out over here. I went to school, got into UC Davis, and I was so interested in the viticulture and enology program because it checks all of the boxes for anyone that's pre-med or anyone getting into a science heavy field or wants to go to graduate school that needs sort of that science background. So I applied. I actually was during that time I was reading Karen McNeil's The Wine Bible. It
Mm,
came out in like early 2000s. I really just thought it was such an interesting sort of overview of all the wines of the world. And so I thought this would be really cool. I can sort of scratch an itch of curiosity by getting into the viticulturology program while also pursuing dental school. But it was after, I think, my second survey course in wine that I thought, I don't know why I would go beyond this. I love learning wine so much. I love the science involved in it, the creativity, which, also for me in dentistry, there was both of those things. There's science and some creativity involved in orthodontia and things like that. And so it really just scratched an itch for me. And I just never looked back to dentistry. And that's where I landed. That's sort of how I landed on that field.
that's awesome because everyone has a different path to it, but like it was in the middle of it that you kind of found your calling per se, and you know was it hard to sit there and say, you know what, I'm going to go down this path? Was there any doubt as you looked at this new path, or was it like, no, this is where I'm supposed to be?
Yeah, I think the biggest sort of help for me to make that decision was my support system at home. I have a really amazing partner, and we have four kids together. And so it was somewhat of a family decision of like, hey, this is what I'm looking at. This is what is interesting to me. and just kind of getting that support from my husband and basically all my cheerleaders at home. Everyone was just like, yes, you should definitely do that. I mean, we live in the East Bay area. We're close to Napa, and there's a lot of wine growing areas actually around here as well. If I wasn't looking into that at the time. I kind of had my sights set on Napa. And yeah, it was hard in that, I'm in my 30s and I'm trying to network and sort of find my way into this very tight knit community. But thankfully, everyone is so welcoming. I never really fell into a place where I felt like isolated or that I wasn't welcome. And so I really just think that decision was hard, but because of my support system and because of how inclusive the wine community is in Napa, it just sort of made it very easy for me to sort of transition into that.
They are one of the things that, growing up in the Napa Valley, like people are really friendly there. Like all of the people are really lovely,
Yeah.
and they're very helpful. Like when I remember when I would meet some of these people, there's not a lot of pretense. Like if you ask questions and you're willing to listen, people are totally willing to talk and share their points and their information, and that's a powerful thing. I wish we had more of that in the world, that we
Yeah.
had people willing to share their knowledge, because it's a
Yeah.
beautiful thing. UC Davis is rigorous, and there's a lot. It's not an easy program. Are there any things that Davis gave you that you still lean on today, especially, around harvest and other things?
Yeah, a lot. I mean, there was a very heavy statistics course that was framed around, it was a sensory course. And so you would have to collect a lot of data. And so when you're collecting the data, if you're tasting through, maybe you're tasting through one particular vintage of wines from all around the world, but it's, one specific varietal, you're giving your notes and you're collaborating with your classmates and you're sort of formatting this big statistical array of sensory notes and then putting that on paper, and you're able to articulate what that wine is just based off of sensory notes from your peers. And I think that the sensory part of it is really what stuck with me. Obviously you have to know all of the science and the chemistry and the biology and grape growing and all of that, but you learn that, but you also kind of learn it along the way within the field. But the sensory part of it was really what stuck with me, and I feel like I was able to carry that with me throughout. I continue to draw on that in my career now. What I might think is, ripe Bing cherry might be a macerated strawberry to someone else, and so it's really important that you're open and you're listening, and you have that sort of you don't just have an echo chamber. Yeah.
That's a good thing to not have to not be surrounded by an echo chamber in a lot of areas of life. And so, especially when you can look at, really qualitative stuff that you can, look at that and break it down. But one of the things that's interesting that you pointed to there was like, individual perspectives, like two people can look at the same thing and have two very different perspectives on it. How does that come into play when you're working winemaking? Like I like this and you like that. How do we find a place where we're appealing to everyone?
So yeah, I think avoiding superimposing what your idea of wine is, and just being open to what someone else's feedback is. But that's working as a contract winemaker. I'm able to work in a custom crush facility. So there's multiple different wineries that are represented in that winery, and I get lucky enough to work into this office that several other winemakers have access to. Not all of them use it. I would say about 8 winemakers are there regularly. And so you're always able to bounce ideas off of people. I've got a glass of wine and I'm trying to evaluate if I think it needs, maybe it's during fermentation and I'm trying to evaluate if it needs a little bit more nutrient or if I've given it enough. And maybe I'm just smelling that it's struggling a little bit because I've been smelling it over the whole week and I've been treating it as such, but then I can hand it off to someone else. I'm like, no, it smells healthy. I wouldn't touch it. So I think, it's really important to be able to draw off of other colleagues and get feedback, even if they're not a winemaker. Maybe it's, one of the cellar crew that is down there and they're, using your wine to top your barrels. And they're like, hey, I opened something up and, it smells great, but it just smells a little different than the lot that I'm topping it with. Can you come down and take a look? And so, you kind of have to trust everyone around you to have all eyes on your wine and also be open to that feedback that, they're giving you. They're not telling you that your wine is bad. They're just telling you that maybe this seems a little bit off and you might want to put eyes on this. So, yeah, I think it's very important to be open to, to sharing your idea and absorbing others as well.
You have to be humble, it sounds like, as well, because sometimes, if you have this idea about the way things are supposed to be, that can be your own worst enemy. I know that I met this one guy who was a very high level filmmaker. And he thought that he never made any mistakes. And I remember one day I was on set with him, and one of the other people called out a mistake that was being made. And he's just was like, I don't make mistakes. And we kept working. And then, a bit later, it was evident that there had been a mistake made, that we had to go back and do it again. And I'm not, just so everyone is aware, we had this conversation before, and there was some technical difficulties, and the recording stopped. And I had to send you a letter afterwards. Like, it was probably one of the most embarrassing things I've ever had to send. But like, I think that one of the things that I learned from watching other people is like, if you can collaborate, if you can be humble, if you can be open, people are more receptive to that than someone who's closed off and thinks they know everything.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
And it gives you more room to grow too.
Yeah. Well, and you have to, especially with an industry like this where, no vintage is going to be the same. It's important that you're drawing from, the more experienced winemakers about what you're seeing in the vineyard. Hey, I usually, bud break is happening on this date and it's still, we're still kind of hanging around. What are your thoughts about that? What should I look out for? There's so much that we need as our industry is so small. We need to draw on those other winemakers or vineyard managers and everyone really in this industry to help us get a bigger picture of what's happening environmentally and also within the cellar.
That's awesome. Well, you've worked
Yeah.
under some really respected producers in Napa. Are there anything that those mentorships taught you about excellence that kind of stayed with you?
Yeah, for sure. So right out of Davis, I was able to, I did a couple internships and then I landed with Celia Welch in Napa. And she manages, at the time, she was managing 7 different clients and all varying levels of production from, 3,000 cases down to, um, 250. So on a pretty small scale. So, and within that, we were working across 9 to 10 different AVAs at any given time.
Wow.
So we're harvesting over a pretty long, period of time, even though it's somewhat of a short window of 3 weeks. But so yeah, that mentorship, I still get the privilege of saying that I continue to have with Celia. She still is the winemaking director for all 3 of my clients. So, yeah, I think having that level of excellence that she has is something that I aspire to have myself. She's never been this person that has this formula of this is how I make wine and I'm not doing it any other way. She has this I like to describe it as sort of she's a precision based winemaker that also draws on her intuition. And I think that that's something that I'm able to learn along the way as well. That, we have these tools and we have this really rigorous, program that we went through at Davis. But also there's a level of intuition that you have to inject when you're making that wine. And I think that that's something that she's able to, guide me with. And again, she is still my mentor. I get to sit shoulder to shoulder with her for the most part of the week. And it's really lovely to be able to have that resource and that support from her. Yeah.
That's awesome. Now, you handle winemaking for three different brands, but like, how does your role shift when you're shaping different brands? Like, everyone has their own different flavors and way of doing things. How do you balance these different vibes, different tones, different stories? How do you? I don't know how even
Yeah.
to put the word on it.
Yeah, I mean, a Coombsville cab is not going to be like a Yountville cab as much as you want to try and make it that way. Even if I do work with, I might be working with the same clone in Coombsville as I am in Rutherford or in Yountville. But those wines are going to be vastly different. So again, it kind of goes back to not superimposing what my idea of what that needs to be and more guiding that wine into what it's meant to be, and respecting the terroir and respecting the environment and not picking, not picking pick dates based on convenience, but really what is the weather is projecting to look like. And yeah, there's so many different factors that go into that. But I think that would be an interesting experiment. I wonder even if I tried as hard as I could to make two, wines, one from Coombsville and one from Rutherford, the same. I think it's pretty much impossible. I mean, you really can't manhandle wine in such a way that you can make it manipulated in that sense. But yeah, you have to really guide those wines in the right direction from where they're from, and not just approaching it from a completely formulaic viewpoint.
I remember. I mean, everyone. I played sports a lot when I was younger, and we would have team sports, and we would play with people in schools and around the country. And it was interesting to see how the tone of each. We were all students. We all had similar upbringings of sorts, but like when you went to different places, there was just this different tone, this different vibe at each of the different schools. And what's interesting is like I always think about that when I think about AVAs and different sites and locations. It's like every single place has a different vibe. I remember we play sports against this one school in Monterey. And Monterey was always cool and moist, and like all of the guys were really chill. They were all surfers. They would go surfing every morning right down by the beach. And then my school was out in the deserts of San Diego, and everyone was spicy and hot, and we were a little bit more fighty, and it was just very different. But you could see that the tone and the climate of each of these places reflected, on the people and the way we acted. And I'm always thinking about that. And so what you're just describing about how I don't know how, yeah, I like to say, like, it's impossible to take things that grow in different places and then try to put them together and say, now be the same. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah. 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 And I mean, sometimes you're in a place where, you're not necessarily making, or maybe you're making an estate blend, but you need just like a little bit of something extra to add to it. Maybe it's a Petit Verdot, maybe it's a Cab Franc, and maybe it's at a percent, 2% level. And you might be looking at, so say your base wine is let's go with Yountville. And you just need a little bit of Petit Verdot. Well, you don't grow Petit Verdot on property, so you can try and source that. And you source it from various different areas of Napa Valley. It doesn't mean the Yountville Petit Verdot is going to fit perfectly with the Yountville. Sometimes they just don't play nice. And so
Mm,
I think it's also just making sure that you want to keep it very specific to the growing area. But you also want to be respectful of that wine. And so everything sort of has to be in balance. And so that's just a really fun place to be able to play with wine and be artistic. So you can't get too, I guess, myopic in that, it's Yountville and it has to be Yountville, because 2% isn't going to tip the scales on a label. And, it's still in compliance if it's out of that AVA. But yeah, I think it's also just having an open mind to things as well, because it's not as, straightforward as you might think it would be. Just because it's Yountville doesn't mean it needs to have a Yountville 2% edition.
That makes me think of a couple of the things. It's like I was reading as as I was prepping for this second time we talked. I looked at your LinkedIn profile, and there was something that you posted on a post last year about restraint and timing. And I thought that was so interesting, because so often in life we try to do more when we want to accomplish something, but sometimes you have to step back and you have to wait for the right moment to do it. Whether it be a podcast that you have to re-record because something goes
Yeah.
on and you have to pull back and slow down. Or, whether it be, I had this one individual that I was trying to get to come work with me as a client. And the first time I talked to him, it just fell apart. It wasn't even just that it fell apart.
Mm.
It was not a fun communication. And then I
Yeah.
just let it go. And then at the end of the year, I was like, I just want to send thank you letters to people. And I sent a thank you letter. And he was like, you know what? I'd love to have that conversation, keep the ball rolling forward. And it was just like water under the bridge. And we started working together, and it's been great. And I was just sitting there thinking, like, if this had been a couple months ago or a couple of years ago, it wouldn't have flown. It wouldn't have.
Yeah.
Sometimes the best thing we can do is to slow down
Mhm.
and do less, and then wait for the right moment to act.
Yeah, I mean, that I mentioned earlier, I have 4 kids, and it's not that different when it comes to that mentality. When you're just as much as you want to try and make something fit into the box that you might have intended for it, it will have to do it on its own. My kids won't do something just because I'm forcing them to do it. And if they do, they're probably not going to do it the way that they want to do it. And it's important to sort of give them that breathing room. And it really is the same with wine. It's just before the winter break. So because I work out of a custom crush, and I think that this happens at larger facilities as well. We have to close down for at least a week for the Christmas or the holiday break. And this year just kind of fell. The timing ended up being a week and a half. And so you see a lot of, we're not scrambling necessarily, but it's more of okay, we want to get these wines into a nice stable state so that when we leave it alone for a week and a half and we come back to it, it's right where we left it. And that's, I guess, the intention. And so you do as much as you possibly can, and you get frustrated because you're like, it's finished a primary fermentation. It needs to go through secondary. But as soon as it's finished with secondary, there's potential for spoilage, small amounts of spoilage to happen and actually large amounts of spoilage to happen in a very short amount of time. And so you really have to be vigilant, and you have to get on those wines. So you're somewhat trying to push it through that secondary fermentation so that you can put a little bit of sulfur into it and then let it take a nap. But some of these wines were just like, nope, we're good. We're nice and dry for RS, and we're just gonna start kind of cracking away at ML, but at a very, very slow pace. And so you just let it go. And I was losing a lot of sleep over that break. I can't go into the winery as much as I want to. I know that my wines are stable, but it's still just something that it's like, oh, I just wish I could have, it could have been finished before I left. So anyway, I go back in the day that break is over, and I visit those wines, and they're all just fabulous. I mean, they all have matured in their own way, and it really just, I feel like that wine was just saying, like, you just need to step back and let me do my thing, and I will get to where I need to be when I'm ready. So it was sort of one of those. It's a very whimsical story, but it is sort of one of those things where you just kind of have to step back sometimes and let the wine sort of speak the way that it wants to speak and go at its own timing. So yeah, very much like children.
right in right, and I think that I remember growing up that if someone tried to get me to do something at a time I didn't want to do it, especially at a younger age, it was not going to happen. But
Yeah.
there were so many times that like parents gave me advice, and I was just like, "Whatever, mom and dad, you don't understand anything," And then years
Right.
later, I go back, I'm like, "Oh my god, that was great advice. Why didn't I listen? Why didn't you make me listen?" And they're like, "I tried, I tried," and and
No, I do that with my oldest. Now I'm like, I know you don't like the advice I'm giving you right now, but one day you're going to really need this advice and you're going to tell me I'm right, even though he probably won't.
They will, I'm sure, at least, and when they do, I will rub it in. I will rub it in.
Yes.
I will make sure. I was like, I'm gonna record that. Yeah, this is you. This is what you said. This is what I said.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
guarantee, guarantee,
Yeah.
I'm not gonna
Yeah.
let that go. But
Mm-mm.
sorry. Um, when you um sit down with a client that says to you, I have this vision for my wine, this is where I'd like to be going. How do you kind of steer towards something while also honoring what you have to be doing? I mean, in any creative, I mean, there is skill, but there's also creativity in what you're doing? And so it's like, how do you walk that line? Because there's what the client wants, there's what you want, and there's what the wine wants. How do you
Mhm.
balance all of those pieces?
Yeah. I think I know I'm very fortunate to, right now work with clients that are they trust me with the production process of the winemaking. Every now and then there's something like, hey, we want to, it's not every now and then, it's often, we want to change this packaging element. And we want it to be, employed by this year. So for this bottling. And so it's like, okay, well, all of the supplies are already ordered. And that particular packaging element might have to change what the bottle is now. And so now we have to kind of backtrack and things like that. So I think when a client sort of has a vision for what they want, it's really important that you're listening to that and you're doing everything you can to mold to that and to give them all of the options. Because a lot of times, they might be working in Napa, so they might have their finger on the pulse of everything that's going on. And then other times, they live across country and they have no real idea of what the culture is right here in Napa. And so I just think it's important to always be vigilant, always be listening, always be drawing from your colleagues and seeing, okay, so this is what you want to do. Let's find another winery that's doing that and see what they're doing. How are they doing it? But as far as the direction when it comes to winemaking, that's where I feel like our clients are able to let Celia and I sort of steer that ship, and they really trust us with that. And it's really good to have that support from your client.
Well, I want to ask an interesting question because the wine industry is going through changes, and people are asking question about like why is wine still important at this time? Why do you think wine is still so culturally relevant and important going forward?
Yeah, it's a tricky time, but I am sure that we will recover from this. But I do think it's important to remember, wine is supposed to be shared. It's a community beverage. It's we're able to capture history in a bottle. And I know that that sounds sort of, again, very whimsy, but it's true. We're able to take what the environment gave us in this year, and what the soil was giving us and how the clones responded. And we're able to take that and capture it in a bottle. And now we've preserved history. And so I think that that's one of the biggest reasons that wine is very important to us as a culture. We're capturing that history. We're bringing it to the table. We're sharing it with people, and I think it's important that we remember that.
I think so, and I think that like one of the things that um, one of the things that seems special to me is that there's a time and place, and like when we take photos of whatever it is. And especially it used to be different. Like, um, I think it's really interesting that we can see, you know, I was going back through my old Facebook photos and Instagram and all of my social media, and I was just scrolling back trying to find a picture because I wanted to show it to my daughter. And the further back I went, I had all these memories. I was like, "Oh man, remember when we did that?" And it was just all of these images that reminded me of that time and place. And one of the things that I find so fascinating with wine is that every single vintage is a time and place. What was happening in the world at that time. So you drink a 2020. Well, there's a lot that was going on in that year. How about a
Mhm.
2018? How about 2001? There are all these different things. And if you go back and you track it back further and further, there's all this stuff. And like, again, it's constantly, and I've heard winemakers talk to me about this, and I'm not going to overly romanticize it, but there is to a degree a story. It's like a story in a bottle.
Yeah.
What was happening in that time and place, and with that winemaker, and with that wine, and with all of this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, wine is very special, and it wasn't invented, it was discovered, and we can't just eradicate something like that. And I think it's as we all get, as we're getting older, my kids are becoming, they've always been around wine. I mean, I started in this industry when I had my fourth, and she's now 10. So I think it's something that they've always been around, but as you get older, you become more curious, and you want to taste things, and you want to grow your palate and things like that. And so I do think that our culture, thankfully, is continuing to surround ourselves with wine and with community. And with community comes sharing things like that. So yeah, I think wine is it has a very special place in our culture. And I think we all should be protecting that for sure.
If I were to ask you, what's your favorite varietal to work with? What's your favorite wine to make?
Um, that's fun. I Right now I think Sauvignon Blanc. It's really fun because I make Sauvignon Blanc for two different clients, and those two Sauvignon Blancs are the smallest of their program. But I really enjoy working with it because the grape really changes so quickly, and so differently in different AVAs. And I love being in the vineyard and tasting through the grape and deciding on the pick date. But then within the cellar, it's just really cool because there's a lot that happens with Sauvignon Blanc in the beginning. You're really, trying to clarify everything, and you're trying to get it nice and stable so that you can start fermenting it, and you get it going in the tank only to guide it into a barrel and let it finish doing its thing in barrel. And I just really love the process of getting the Sauvignon Blanc nice and fermented, but it just changes every single week, and it's really very beautiful. And so you can decide: do I want to keep it on the lees? Do I want to stir the lees more often? Do I want to hold back? Do I want to only stir these barrels on lees? Do I want to take some of that wine and put it in a stainless steel? And so I feel like a lot of decision making happens really early on for Sauvignon Blanc. And I think that's why I love it so much, because it's just continuing to evolve, and you sort of have to draw on your technical winemaking and your intuition at the same time.
Love that. Well, one thing too, like when you're working in the cellar, there's so many places. There are so many things that are going on, and there are so many steps. I had someone that said something really interesting. You can't make good wine from bad grapes, but you can make bad wine from good grapes, and like
Yeah.
this is the thing that I'm just fascinated by, and terrified by. I would love to learn to make wine, but like I'm terrified that I would make them. I made a purse for my wife once, and I'm proud of
Wow.
it. I love leatherworking. I made
Oh,
my own wallet.
wow.
Yeah, I love making things from leather. I'm not great. I follow patterns, and I have great teachers.
Hmm.
Um, but the wallet, my wife wanted a nice wallet, a purse, and the purse that she was like talking about was what was it, a Hermes, like Birkin, and like a Tiffany bag, and I was like, I can't afford that. those are expensive. But I found a
Yeah.
teacher, and he was officially trained by one of the people at MS, and he just went and created his own things, and he was making his own bags that were inspired by the MS bags.
Yeah.
And I was like, "Hey, can you teach me to make this bag?" And he's like, "It's going to take a while." And I was like, "I've got time." And it was like over 20 separate classes I made this bag, but it was
Wow.
terrifying because the leather itself was like $1,000 just for this bag. And I'm just like,
Mhm.
and I'm like, "So if I cut this wrong, what happens?" And he's like, "Well, we need to get more leather." And I was just like, "Oh my goodness." And that was just one piece of leather that's $1,000.
Yeah.
The grapes are extremely expensive, you
Yeah.
know, and has there ever been a moment that truly tested you where you had to just trust the process and trust what you had learned?
Yeah. Um, I want to say this happened. So in 2021, I'm sitting down with Celia, and it's my first full year as her assistant winemaker. And I was just looking over labs, and it was I want to say maybe 2 months after harvest. So we're in November, and so we're trying to get the wines stable. I just kind of had this moment, and I looked at her and I said, "Well, what do we do if it doesn't work? Like, what do we do if the VA goes off the rails? And uh, like, what do we do aside from like DVA? You can pull the VA out, but you're stripping the wine." She's like, "There's no option to fail here. So yes, if that VA goes off, we have to figure out ways of changing that or finding ways of blending it. But you can never get to a place where it's like, well, this is done. We have to send it down the drain. Like, it's just not an option. So in that sense, that's the failure. It's not the failure is refusal to fix the problem once there's a problem, and so we're not just saying, oh, there's a problem, it's done, we failed. It's saying we're not going to fix that problem. That's the failure. And so that's just not an option. And so I think being able to adapt and adjust, and also, again, going back to talking to your colleagues, hey, this is what I'm seeing. Are you guys getting a little bit of VA that kind of came out of nowhere? Like, what's going on with your wine? And most of the time, you can find people that can relate to you, but also say, yeah, I had that problem and this is what I did. And it's not always VA related. That's the extreme. But it's just, being able to draw on the people that are around you. And so, yeah, I just feel like failure is such a, when it comes to the winemaking part of it, I just don't feel like that's an option. You have to solve that problem.
I love
Every problem, I do think, in the winery has been solvable so far. So far so good.
That's awesome. It's like in life, we are all going to be faced with certain sets of problems. And if you have we are just not going to fail. I remember, I can't remember what it was, but there was this situation. Oh, I'm trying to figure out what it was from, but it was this great story about this person that was running this rescue. And they're like, "You know what? We don't know if we can rescue everyone." And the person running the rescue said, "That is not an option. We're not failing, And you hear all
Yeah.
these stories. One of the stories that fascinated me recently was, and I got to, well, some of my friends made the movie with Ron Howard, but was the Thai cave rescue. Do you ever hear that story?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
kids that got
With the young
yeah,
boys.
the young
Yeah.
boys that went into and, like, but some of my friends were like, "How can that happen, that rain?" And I was like, "You don't understand rain in Southeast Asia. I do. I've been here where we
Mhm.
get a downpour. It's not like rain in California where it's slow and steady for 5 days. Rain here in Southeast Asia can be this insane downpour that our street will suddenly go from no water to, like, 3 feet of water in 10
Yeah.
minutes. It's, like, insane. And the whole movie, the whole story, they're just like, failure was not an option. We will find ways to make this
Yeah.
work. And it's such a
Yeah.
beautiful way to look at life, that you can do that. I want to ask you another question. When someone opens a bottle that you've made, what do you hope that they sense about your approach before they even know who it was that made it?
Yeah. What a great question. I think I don't really want to put my identity wine. I do think that it's important that, again, we shepherd those wines in the direction that, they should be going in based off of terroir and vineyard and place. I don't want to put my stamp on everything so that when someone opens it, oh yeah, that's a Jess McDowell wine. It's just I want there to be an enjoyable experience that is wonderful from start to finish. That's really what you really want, and that's what we're doing when we're tasting and we're blending. Is that okay? How is the entry and does it match the finish? And when we're approaching the mid palate, is it hollow or is it nice and smooth? Is there a crescendo and then a decrescendo? So you want that balance. And again, I don't want it to be like, yep, that's the Jess McDowell. She added the, 2% of this or that. I don't want that. I want it to be a nice, smooth, lovely experience that can be shared with everyone.
I love that. And that's the heart of wine. And I think that that's something I try to tell people, and I'm just always remembering, is that wine is meant to be shared. It is this experience where, if you're, I mean, I'm not going to judge you if you do, but I don't enjoy a bottle of wine all by myself. It's much more
Mhm.
fun to have it, with people that I care about, and to be able to sit with them and enjoy it together is, to me, the real secret of what it's all about. This
Yeah,
this ability to share a great experience and to be connected with one another, and to have, if some little something, the drink can do that, then that's a good thing.
I agree. Yeah.
Where can people find out more about the wines that you are making, or about what you do?
Yeah. So my LinkedIn, it's Jess McDowell, pretty easy to find. Rewa Vineyards has a website. I believe it's rewavineyards.com. Really wonderful website that was, I think, recently updated. But you can find all of the wines that I make there. Kever Vineyards also as well, and Lindstrom. And so those are the three that I'm working with right now. And yeah, you can find all of that when you look it up on Google.